The gavel came down with a crack so sharp it felt like it split the air in two. Judge Thomas leaned forward, his voice thick with authority, as he delivered the words that froze every face in the courtroom. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is hereby fined $500 million. For a moment, silence, then a rush of disbelief, a wave of gasps, muffled cries, the frantic scratching of reporters' pens desperate to capture the headline of a lifetime. $500 million, a penalty so absurd it sounded less like justice and more like vengeance. The cameras clicked in rapid fire, catching Crockett's stillness. Her hands folded, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Around her, aides shifted nervously, eyes darting between the bench and the woman who had just been hit with one of the most staggering fines in American legal history. Across the aisle, Judge Thomas sat back, lips curling in the faintest shadow of a smirk, as if daring anyone to challenge his command of the room. Whispers swirled through the gallery. Is this even legal? She'll never recover. This will end her career. The words carried the weight of finality, as though the hammer had not only come down on Crockett, but on everything she represented. Her fight, her voice, her defiance of those who believed power was theirs to hoard. But in the center of the storm, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't slam the table, didn't shout in protest. Instead, she breathed, slow and measured, as if she understood something the others did not. The cameras tried to catch it, the reporters tried to frame it, but what they were really capturing was a woman in the eye of a manufactured hurricane. A hurricane summoned by the very man who believed he had destroyed her. Because what Judge Thomas could not know, what no one in that room yet suspected, was that this thunderbolt he had hurled in arrogance was about to ricochet back upon him. What was meant to crush her would, in mere minutes, begin to unravel him. The fine was not the end of Jasmine Crockett's story. It was the beginning of his. And as the echo of the gavel still lingered, the courtroom leaned forward, waiting to see what she would do next. $500 million. The figure didn't just hang in the air, it detonated. No precedent, no legal rationale that anyone could name, just raw power crashing down like a hammer. In the history of American jurisprudence, fines this astronomical had been reserved for multinational corporations caught poisoning rivers or fixing markets. Never for a single elected official. Never for a woman who had built her career standing up to the very machinery now bearing down on her. It was more than punishment, it was a message, a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the wrong man at the wrong moment. Judge Thomas sat reclined on his bench, fingers steepled, face carved into the mask of a man convinced of his own untouchability. His robe seemed less like a symbol of impartial justice and more like armor. A shield for his ego, a costume granting him the illusion that he towered above the people, above accountability, above the nation he was meant to serve. To him, the law wasn't blind. The law was his. And in that moment, the imbalance was staggering. One man cloaked in authority, wielding the full weight of the judicial system like a personal sword. One woman, isolated, targeted. Her dignity pitted against not just the ruling, but against the entire machinery that had enabled him. The courtroom felt less like a chamber of justice and more like an arena. An ancient spectacle where power was the spectacle and fairness the casualty. The whispers grew sharper. He can get away with this. Nobody stops Thomas. He had spent years cultivating this reputation, this aura of invincibility. Politicians whispered his name with both respect and fear. His record bristled with decisions that bent laws into the shape of his own convictions, each one reinforcing the belief that he stood beyond challenge. The arrogance in his smirk wasn't arrogance alone. It was history repeating itself, another chapter in a career built on people backing down, people surrendering. But in the stillness where others saw the end of Jasmine Crockett, something different was stirring. Because she wasn't just any target. She was the daughter of strivers, the voice of constituents who had endured too many silencings, too many insults dressed up as verdicts. To them, she wasn't merely a politician, she was proof that dignity could sit at the same table as power. And to them, what had just been dealt out wasn't merely a fine. It was an attack on the very idea that ordinary people could rise and demand to be heard. Judge Thomas believed the gavel was the last word, but what he never considered was the possibility that the courtroom itself, those gathered in the pews, those watching on screens across the country, could turn. The arrogance that made him bold enough to drop a $500 million bomb also blinded him to the cracks forming in the spectacle he thought he controlled. For every gasp of disbelief, there was also a spark of outrage. For every whisper of despair, there was also a murmur of defiance. The imbalance of power was real. But so too was the gathering storm of those who would no longer accept it. And at the center of that storm sat Jasmine Crockett, calm as a woman who knew this wasn't her downfall at all. Because while Judge Thomas tried to bury her with numbers no human could bear, she was preparing to answer with something far heavier, the truth. But Crockett wasn't about to bow down. She was about to ignite something nobody in that room expected. To understand the weight of that gavel strike, you have to understand the man who wielded it. Judge Thomas wasn't merely a judge. He was an institution unto himself, a figure who had wrapped himself in the mystique of untouchable authority. For decades, he had been described in hushed tones powerful, immovable, a man you simply didn't cross if you valued your career, your reputation, or your peace of mind. He had become more than a jurist. He was a myth, a shadow looming over every courtroom he entered. His rise was no accident. Thomas was not born into privilege, but he quickly learned how to seize it. Early in his career, he cultivated powerful alliances, business magnates, political operatives, donors who saw in him a man willing to bend law into opportunity. In exchange for their support, he handed down rulings that favored the entrenched, the wealthy, the connected. Over time, he built an empire of influence. Those who benefited from his decisions defended him, and those who dared question him were silenced, ridiculed, or crushed under the sheer weight of his position. He wore the robe like a crown, each controversial ruling another jewel studded into his self-forged diadem. He struck down voting protections in one case, then railed against government oversight in another. To his allies, these were principled stands. To his critics, they were thinly veiled attempts to tilt the balance of power toward those already sitting at the top. What was consistent wasn't fairness, but favoritism. What was constant wasn't justice, but arrogance. And then there was the hypocrisy, layer upon layer of it. He had, on countless occasions, thundered about personal responsibility, about the need for ordinary citizens to bear the consequences of their actions. Yet behind closed doors, he was entangled in ethical shadows, luxury trips paid for by benefactors, financial disclosures that raised more questions than they answered, whispers of decisions influenced by friendships that strayed well beyond the bounds of impartiality. When cornered, he brushed it off as conspiracy, as envy, as attacks on a man who simply refused to play by the polite rules of Washington. His arrogance wasn't hidden. It was his armor, his shield, his declaration that he was too big to be held accountable. It was this cultivated image that kept him insulated. Colleagues bowed to him, politicians hesitated to speak his name, and commentators framed his every decision as untouchable, as though the robe itself made him immune to criticism. In this world he had built, Judge Thomas was not a servant of justice, he was the law incarnate, or so he wanted everyone to believe. And yet, beneath the marble pedestal, cracks had long begun to form. For every ruling that enriched corporations, there were families left devastated. For every dismissal of oversight, there were communities who lost their voice. He preached about the sanctity of the Constitution, but bent it to justify his biases. He spoke of morality, but lived in ways that betrayed the very values he projected. His contradictions weren't just footnotes. They were the foundation of his reign, and the very reason his arrogance had gone unchecked for so long. The courtroom that day was supposed to be his stage, one more performance in a long career of dominance. By levying an impossible fine against Jasmine Crockett, he thought he was doing what he had always done, flexing his power, reminding everyone who truly held control. To him, she was just another name on a long list of those who had been silenced, intimidated, or broken under his gavel. But arrogance is blinding. In believing himself immune, he failed to see that the world beyond his echo chamber had changed. People were no longer willing to bow their heads. The myth of his untouchability was fraying, and Crockett's defiance was about to expose just how fragile his throne really was. Because for all his alliances, for all his rulings, for all the decades of dominance, one truth remained as old as power itself: the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. To grasp why Jasmine Crockett sat so still in that courtroom, you have to know the story of the woman behind the name. She was not born into wealth or privilege. She didn't inherit a network of power brokers waiting to open doors. Her childhood was the story of countless Americans whose grit is their only currency. The daughter of working parents who taught her that dignity was not optional, that a voice unused was a voice wasted. In classrooms where teachers underestimated her, she worked twice as hard, not just to prove them wrong, but to prove that children like her deserved to be seen. Nights were spent with books stacked higher than her pillow, mornings with determination etched into her face. There was no golden path, no shortcuts. Every inch forward had to be carved with persistence. When she chose law, it wasn't the easy choice. It wasn't the lucrative one. She could have joined firms that promised wealth and comfort, but she turned instead to the cases others ignored. The evicted families, the workers cheated by employers, the mothers silenced by bureaucracy. She walked into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her, and she stayed because she knew that justice isn't measured by how often it wins. It's measured by whether someone stands up and demands it, even when losing seems inevitable. Her sacrifices were not invisible. She worked nights no one paid for, sat in offices with flickering fluorescent lights, comforted clients who had nothing to give her in return but trust. She traded security for service, wealth for the weight of responsibility. Each case she took was a stone in the foundation of her reputation, fearless, unbought, and unbowed. It was this foundation that led her into public service. Politics wasn't a plan, it was an inevitability. Her community needed more than a defender in court. They needed a fighter in Congress. And when she won her seat, it wasn't because big donors cleared the path. It was because ordinary people, the very people who had seen her stand beside them in their darkest hours, believed she could carry their voices into the halls of power. Crockett became known as fiery yet focused, unafraid to clash with entrenched figures who dismissed her. She wore her identity proudly, not as an accessory but as armor. As a black woman in a space that too often tried to shrink her, she refused to be small. She spoke with the urgency of someone who knew her words weren't just her own. They were borrowed from generations denied the microphone, entrusted to her by those who had no platform but deserved one. And that is precisely why this $500 million fine was more than a number. It wasn't just a penalty on a ledger. It was an attempt to erase that voice. To silence the very symbol that her presence had become, that the overlooked could rise, that the underestimated could stand toe to toe with men who thought themselves kings. Judge Thomas didn't find a politician, he found a movement. Her journey had prepared her for this moment in ways the judge could never understand. Because where he drew strength from privilege and position, she drew strength from struggle. Where his authority rested on fear, hers rested on faith. The faith of people who had believed in her when she had nothing but determination to give. To them, this ruling wasn't just outrageous. It was personal. Every mother who had scraped to pay rent, every worker denied a fair wage, every student told they'd never make it. They saw in Crockett's calm face a reflection of themselves. And they knew the fine was meant to crush that reflection into dust. But Crockett's story was never one of surrender. From the child who studied under dim lights, to the lawyer who defended the voiceless, to the congresswoman who entered chambers that weren't built for her. Every chapter had taught her the same lesson. When the system tries to silence you, you don't whisper, you speak louder. You stand taller. You turn their attempt to erase you into proof that you matter. This courtroom was not the first battlefield she had faced, and it would not be the last, but it was, perhaps, the most symbolic. Because now it wasn't just her career or her clients' futures on the line. It was the principle that ordinary Americans could claim a seat at the table, even when the powerful slammed the door. As she sat under the glare of Judge Thomas's gaze, she wasn't thinking only of herself. She was thinking of her parents' sacrifices, of the clients who had trusted her, of every constituent who sent her to Congress believing she would carry their truth. This wasn't about $500 million. It was about silencing everything she stood for, and that was something Jasmine Crockett had never, and would never, allow. The gavel's echo had barely faded when Judge Thomas leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "Congresswoman, your protestations are irrelevant. The record speaks for itself. This court does not bend to theatrics." His tone wasn't judicial, it was condescending. The kind of dismissal meant not just to silence but to belittle. He didn't see an elected representative before him. He saw a nuisance, a woman to be put back in her place with a few well-aimed barbs and the weight of his title. But Jasmine Crockett did not shrink. She met his gaze, steady and unshaken, her posture as unyielding as stone. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said evenly, "justice does not begin or end with your record. It begins with truth." Her words cut through the room not with volume but with conviction, the kind of conviction that lingers in the air long after it's spoken. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Reporters looked up from their notepads, sensing a spark. The spectators, many of them regular citizens who had fought for a seat inside, sat straighter, drawn into the invisible tug of war between arrogance and resolve. Even the clerks at the edge of the bench paused in their scribbling, their eyes flicking nervously between the judge and the congresswoman who dared to challenge him. Thomas's jaw tightened. "This is not a platform for political grandstanding," he snapped, his words sharpened with irritation. "You are here to answer to the consequences of your actions, not to lecture this court." His voice rose, filling the chamber with the vibration of authority unchecked. He had silenced so many before with that tone, with that scowl, with the raw weight of his position. But this time, the silence that followed wasn't submission. It was anticipation. Crockett's calm was unsettling him, and everyone could see it. She didn't rush to fill the pause, didn't let his tone pull her into anger. Instead, she let the moment stretch, her stillness exposing the cracks in his bluster. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, measured, almost too quiet, but the quiet made people lean in. Respectfully, Judge Thomas, the American people deserve more than fines, pulled from thin air and judgments that serve power instead of truth. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some heads nodded subtly, others whispered beneath their breath. Ordinary people, hardened by years of watching figures like Thomas tower above them, were now watching someone who refused to flinch. There was no shouting, no dramatics. Just the relentless force of dignity, colliding with a man accustomed to being unchallenged. The tension climbed higher with every exchange. Thomas slammed back with citations, with lofty declarations of order and authority. Crockett countered with patience, pointing out contradictions without raising her voice. Each calm answer from her landed like a stone in the silence, while each sharp retort from him rang louder, more defensive, more brittle. The imbalance that had defined the courtroom at the start was beginning to shift, almost imperceptibly, as the spectators felt the scales teeter. And with every word, the dynamic inverted. Thomas, once the picture of composure, was leaning forward now, gripping the bench as if holding onto authority itself. Crockett, fined $500 million, sat as though the number didn't weigh her down at all. The power he believed absolute was leaking, slipping, unraveling before their eyes. In the corners of the room, whispers became bolder. She's standing her ground. His rattled. The sense of imbalance was giving way to something more dangerous for Thomas. The feeling that the room itself was no longer on his side. Still, he pressed on, as if louder declarations could restore the control he was losing. "This is not your stage," he barked. "This is my court, and you will respect it." His words echoed harshly, but instead of inspiring fear, they rang hollow, as though even the walls refused to carry their weight. Crockett let him finish, unhurried, her eyes never leaving his. And then, as the murmurs swelled and the cameras caught the tension etched into every face, she leaned forward ever so slightly, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the chamber. And then, the narrator's tone would whisper, she found her opening, the moment that would turn everything upside down. For a long moment, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. The courtroom was loud with silence, the kind that hums against the walls, the kind that forces every ear to strain for the next word. Judge Thomas sat expectantly, tapping his fingers against the bench, as if to remind her who commanded the room. Yet in that pause, in that calm stillness, the imbalance shifted again, because silence was no longer his weapon. It was hers. When she finally spoke, her tone was quiet, deliberate, and measured. "You say the record speaks for itself," she began, her words slow enough that the stenographer's keys seemed hesitant. "But this fine, this $500 million, was not written in any record. Not in statute. Not in precedent. Not in the annals of justice. It exists only in your imagination, Judge Thomas. And imagination has never been the law of this land." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, pens racing, while spectators exchanged knowing glances. Thomas shifted in his chair, his smirk flickering for the first time. "Careful, Congresswoman," he growled. "You tread dangerously close to contempt." Crockett did not blink. She let the warning hang, then answered with the calm of someone who knew fear was the trap he always set. "Contempt, Your Honor, is not defined as pointing out the truth. Contempt is when the robe you wear becomes a shield for bias, when authority becomes a weapon instead of a service. If defending the Constitution is contempt, then perhaps this court should ask itself what side of history it stands on." The tension in the room was electric. One clerk's pen slipped from his hand. A woman in the gallery exhaled sharply, as though she'd been holding her breath since the trial began. Even the court reporter, trained to remain neutral, allowed the faintest arch of her brow. Thomas slammed his palm against the bench. "Enough. This court will not be lectured by a defendant who refuses to take responsibility for her actions." His voice boomed, echoing across the chamber. But this time, the echo did not feel like command. It felt like desperation. Crockett seized the moment. Her voice stayed calm, but her words grew sharper, each one slicing into the contradictions he thought were hidden. "My actions," she repeated, her eyes steady. "My action was serving my district. My action was giving a voice to the people who elected me. And your action, Judge Thomas, was to bury that voice under a fine so absurd it mocks the very institution you claim to protect. The law is not your personal kingdom. And I, unlike you, answer not to power, but to people." A murmur rose from the back rows, swelling until it was quickly hushed by bailiffs. But the damage was done. The atmosphere had shifted. The spectators no longer looked at Crockett as a woman on trial, but as a challenger standing against the man who had always towered unopposed. Thomas leaned forward, his composure cracking. "You presume much," he hissed. "You think you can stand in this courtroom and dictate what the law is?" Crockett waited, her eyes unblinking, letting the question fall heavy in the silence. Then she answered, softly but with precision, "No. I don't presume. I remember. I remember the Constitution you swore to uphold. I remember the precedents that guide this court, and I remember that no one, is above the people. Not even you." The effect was seismic. Spectators gasped openly now, whispers hissing like wind through the chamber. One reporter's pen stopped entirely, frozen mid-word, as though she knew this was the line that would headline every story tomorrow. Thomas's face flushed, a visible crack in his mask of authority. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if the words he reached for had abandoned him. For the first time, the room didn't see a towering figure above reproach. They saw a man rattled, cornered, vulnerable beneath the weight of the truth he could not silence. And Crockett pressed forward, her tone unrelenting but never raised. "This fine is not justice. It is punishment for daring to speak truth to power. It is meant to silence not just me, but every person who has ever stood up against arrogance disguised as authority. But understand this, Judge Thomas, voices like mine do not disappear. They grow louder. And when you try to crush them, they multiply." Every word landed like a hammer, the soundless kind that doesn't need wood or metal to echo. It echoed in the hearts of everyone listening. Reporters scribbled furiously, people in the gallery shifted with barely contained energy, and the camera shutters clicked like thunder. Thomas tried again to interject, but Crockett raised her hand slightly, not in disrespect but in calm insistence. And the shocking part, the room allowed it. The judge's authority had slipped so far that her gesture carried more gravity than his gavel. "History will not remember the size of your fine," she concluded, her voice now carrying a steady force. "It will remember the arrogance with which you tried to impose it, and the courage with which it was rejected. You thought this was my downfall, but the truth, Judge Thomas, is that this is your mirror. And you may not like what it reflects." The silence that followed was unlike the earlier silences. This one was heavy, final, a silence of realization. The spectators sat frozen, the tension unbearable, as though the room itself was waiting for the walls to crack. Thomas's hand trembled slightly as it moved toward the gavel, the symbol of authority he had always leaned upon. But the gavel no longer felt like command. It felt like retreat, because in that chamber, power had shifted. The fine, the ruling, the arrogance. It had all collapsed under the weight of a single truth spoken with unshakable dignity. The cameras captured it all, Crockett steady, Thomas faltering, the spectators whispering in disbelief at the reversal they had just witnessed. A courtroom meant to be her grave had become his reckoning. And as the gavel hovered in his hand, the unthinkable happened. The instant Judge Thomas's gavel stalled mid-air, the courtroom exploded, not with shouts or chants, but with the sound of hundreds of voices surging all at once. Reporters bolted from their benches, phones raised, rushing for the exits as if history itself might slip away if they didn't carry it out first. The buzz of camera shutters gave way to the staccato click of tweets being fired into the digital ether. And within minutes, a tidal wave began to rise outside those walls. The first hashtag emerged before the court had even recessed Fast Stand with Crockett. Then another, for courtroom courage. Screens lit up across the country as clips of Crockett's takedown flooded timelines. Her calm defiance, her piercing words, the moment Thomas faltered under the weight of his own arrogance. Memes sprouted overnight. Side-by-side photos compared her steady gaze to his crumbling expression, dignity vs. ego. Animated GIFs looped endlessly, the judge gripping his gavel like a lifeline, Crockett delivering her mic drop line with surgical precision. Cable news scrambled to reframe the narrative. On one network, pundits tried to defend Thomas, stammering about legal technicalities, but their voices were drowned out by viral compilations that showed his contradictions exposed. On progressive outlets, commentators hailed Crockett as a modern-day David, slinging truth at a Goliath robed in corruption. The story was no longer about a fine. It was about a confrontation that captured the nation's imagination. Late-night talk show hosts turned Thomas into a punchline. One monologue opened with, $500 million. Did he confuse the courtroom with a monopoly board? Laughter rolled through audiences as clips of Crockett's composure were replayed to standing ovations. The court's solemn marble walls had birthed something no ruling could contain, a cultural moment. But it wasn't just entertainment. Political commentators seized the deeper significance. Analysts traced Thomas's long record of questionable decisions, weaving Crockett's takedown into a larger story of accountability that had long been overdue. "This isn't just about one fine," one anchor declared. "It's about a system where arrogance has gone unchecked." And one woman who refused to bow. Out on the streets, the ripple spread even further. In cities across the country, rallies sprang up overnight. Homemade posters bore Crockett's words, "The law is not your personal kingdom." Protesters chanted in unison, their voices echoing through avenues like the chorus of a movement. What had begun as a single confrontation in a courtroom now thundered as a collective demand for dignity and fairness. Even in unexpected corners, the effect was felt. Teachers played the clip in civics classes, urging students to see the power of standing firm. Pastors quoted Crockett's words in Sunday sermons about truth and integrity. Immigrant families, watching on phones in kitchens and community centers, shared the clip with pride, telling their children, "Look, that's how you speak truth, even when the odds are against you." Meanwhile, Thomas found himself mocked in places where he had once been revered. Editorial cartoons depicted him as a crumbling statue, cracks spidering across his marble facade. His face became shorthand for arrogance toppled. Former allies grew silent, unwilling to defend a man whose aura of invincibility had been shattered in front of cameras watched by millions. His pedestal, once towering, now stood cracked and hollow. And Crockett. She was no longer just a congresswoman, she was a symbol. A clip of her saying, "Voices like mine do not disappear, they grow louder," became a rallying cry replayed at rallies, stitched into music remixes, emblazoned across T-shirts. Her composure in the face of intimidation was transformed into something larger than her. A reminder that courage does not require volume, only conviction. The shockwaves did not stop at borders. International headlines picked up the story, American judge humiliated by Congresswoman's calm defiance. Across oceans, commentators drew parallels to struggles in their own countries, proof that dignity against arrogance was a universal language. What happened in that courtroom resonated, not because of procedure or law, but because it tapped into something timeless, the human hunger for justice. Judge Thomas had intended his fine to bury Jasmine Crockett. Instead, he had buried himself beneath the avalanche of his own overreach. And Crockett, once painted as the underdog, now stood elevated, not by titles or money, but by the validation of millions who saw in her the proof that truth, wielded with dignity, can dismantle even the mightiest facade. But the story wasn't finished. Because as the shockwaves rippled outward, a larger question began to form. One that neither the courtroom nor the nation could ignore. If a single voice could flip the script on a man like Thomas, what would happen when millions followed her lead? And that question hung heavy, just as the movement she ignited gathered momentum. When the storm of cameras and commentary finally eased, Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, not as a politician battling for her own survival, but as a messenger carrying something greater. Reporters begged for sound bites, networks clamored for exclusives, but when she finally addressed the nation, her words rose above the noise with clarity. "This was never about me," she said, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "This was about justice. This was about whether one man's arrogance could outweigh the will of the people, and whether intimidation could silence truth. And today, we proved that it cannot." The line echoed far beyond the microphones. It landed in living rooms and classrooms, in barber shops and church pews, in the hearts of people who had too often felt powerless before systems that seemed too vast to challenge. She wasn't speaking as a victim. She wasn't even speaking as a victor. She was speaking as a reminder that dignity is stronger than corruption, that courage can outlast fear, and that when someone refuses to bend, others find the strength to stand taller. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate Thomas's humiliation or revel in his downfall. Instead, she reframed the spectacle into something higher. If a judge can abuse his power, then all of us must demand accountability, she continued. But if a single voice can expose that abuse, then all of us must remember we have voices too. Power does not belong to those who sit on pedestals. It belongs to the people willing to speak, even when they are told to be silent. The imagery of the courtroom returned as she spoke. People remembered her calm posture, her refusal to flinch when the fine was announced, her deliberate words dismantling the illusion of invincibility. In that memory, they saw not just a congresswoman but a reflection of themselves. Ordinary citizens who had faced intimidation at work, discrimination in society, or dismissal in institutions. They recognized their own struggle in her defiance. And in her triumph, they found validation. Her words lifted into a crescendo. "We are told, too often, that fear is stronger than courage, that corruption is stronger than dignity. But history tells a different story. Every great leap this nation has made came when ordinary people chose dignity over fear, chose truth over silence, chose justice over comfort. The crowd that had gathered outside erupted in applause. Some wept. Others raised fists, not in anger but in solidarity. It was no longer about Crockett's personal battle. It was about reclaiming the belief that America's promise still belonged to its people. Not the powerful few, but the many who demanded fairness, honesty, and respect. Even critics who disagreed with her politics could not deny the resonance. There was something undeniably American in her insistence that no one, not even a robed judge, could rise above accountability. That insistence carried the weight of a shared creed. That democracy survives not on the silence of the people, but on their refusal to be silenced. Inside the courtroom, where it had all begun, the marble columns stood as silent witnesses. They had echoed with arrogance when Thomas announced his ruling. Now they echoed with something different. The memory of a woman who stood tall when the system tried to shrink her, and the undeniable truth that even in the face of overwhelming odds, dignity can illuminate the darkest halls. For those watching, the lesson was clear. You didn't need a title, or a seat in Congress, or a microphone in front of cameras. You needed the courage to hold your ground. You needed the dignity to tell the truth, even when the powerful tried to bury it. And once that truth was spoken, it spread, unstoppable, undeniable, unforgettable. As Crockett concluded, her voice softened but carried with unwavering conviction. This wasn't the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a reminder that America belongs not to the arrogant, but to the brave, and as long as we remember that, justice will never be silenced. The applause swelled into a roar. People embraced, strangers shook hands, and across the nation, a sense of shared purpose flickered to life. The ordeal that was meant to end Jasmine Crockett had instead become a moment to inspire millions. And as she stood beneath the bright lights, dignified and unbroken, the lesson was sealed: corruption crumbles, arrogance falters, but dignity endures, always. And so we return to that moment. Judge Thomas gripping his gavel as if it could still command respect, his once untouchable presence now diminished to a fragile shadow. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett stood unwavering, not defined by the crushing fine he tried to impose, but by the calm, undeniable truth she unleashed. The image was stark, arrogance cracked, dignity shining through. This wasn't just a courtroom clash. It was a reminder that power built on intimidation cannot last, and that truth spoken with courage will always outlive corruption. Crockett's triumph wasn't about one verdict, one fine, or even one judge. It was about proving that even when the system tilts, even when the odds seem insurmountable, dignity has the final word. In the end, Thomas left that courtroom smaller than he entered. Crockett walked out larger than life. Not because she sought glory, but because she embodied something greater: the American spirit of standing tall in the face of injustice. And now the question turns to us. What do we do with this story? Do we let it fade as just another headline? Or do we carry it forward as a call to action? Because if one voice could shake a courtroom, imagine what millions could do together. If you believe voices like Crockett's must be heard, if you believe truth deserves the last word, then share this story. Subscribe, add your voice to this movement, and help amplify the message that dignity always defeats arrogance. This isn't just her fight, it's ours. And the more we speak, the louder justice becomes. Because in the end, the gavel falls silent. But the people, we are the ones who will never be silenced,